The invitation to the Halloween party at the old mansion was something I simply couldn't turn down. Rumor had it that the house had been the site of terrible events and that people even avoided walking down the street where it stood. But that night, everything felt different. Laughter echoed from within, and loud music filled the cold October air. It seemed like the perfect setting for a night of planned fun and scares. As soon as I stepped inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the decorations were eerily realistic. The walls were covered with portraits of old figures whose eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past. Fake cobwebs hung in every corner, but something about their texture felt too real. The main hall was packed with people in costumes, but I felt a slight discomfort when I noticed that some of them had faces too pale to be mere makeup. I decided to explore the house further. One of my friends had mentioned a second floor that no one dared to go up to. It sounded like a challenge, and my curiosity eventually won. I climbed the creaky stairs and found myself in a long, dimly lit corridor. Unlike the ground floor, this space was empty and quiet, with only the distant sound of music and laughter reaching from below. All the doors were locked, except for one that seemed slightly ajar. The room in question was an abandoned playroom of sorts, with old dolls scattered across the floor and shelves filled with dusty teddy bears. The sight was unsettling, especially since some of the dolls were missing eyes, while others had grotesque smiles frozen on their faces. A chill ran down my spine, and a faint whisper seemed to originate from the back of the room. As I turned to leave, I noticed the door was now completely closed. Panic started to set in, as if something were there with me. When I finally managed to open the door and return to the hallway, everything seemed darker, as if the lighting had dimmed further. I hurried down the stairs, feeling the unsettling sensation of being followed. When I reached the main hall, the party was still going on, but something was off. The people now seemed more distant, their costumes more worn, as if they had been standing there for years. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that many of the guests' eyes were vacant, devoid of any expression, and their skin had a grayish tone. I tried to find my friends, but it was as if they had vanished. I decided to leave the house, feeling a sudden urge to escape, but every time I approached the front door, it seemed to move farther away, as if the hall itself were stretching. Suddenly, one of the pale figures grabbed my arm, and I felt a shock of cold so intense that my body shuddered. My vision began to blur, but I could clearly see the figure's face. It appeared distorted, with empty eyes and a frozen smile that revealed uneven, darkened teeth. I managed to break free and desperately ran toward a side door. I rushed down a narrow corridor where shadows seemed to shift along the walls, almost as if they were accompanying me. As I passed a large mirror, I caught sight of my reflection, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving at the same pace as I was. It was slower, as if something inside the mirror was watching me. For a brief moment, it smiled in a way I couldn't replicate, as if it had a life of its own. I reached an abandoned kitchen and looked out the window, only to realize the garden was completely dark, with no sign of light coming from outside. The mansion seemed to be in a void of some sort. I tried to steady my breathing, but the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, as if something was quickly approaching. When I finally turned around, the room was empty, yet there was a heavy presence, as if the air itself were filled with negative energy. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found an exit. I ran out of the house without looking back, feeling the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each step. When I reached the street, I looked back at the mansion, and it appeared darker than before, almost as if the party had never existed. My friends, who had been waiting outside, said I had been gone for nearly 2 hours, though to me it felt like only a few minutes. Since that night, I've never been able to look at that house without feeling a shiver down my spine. What was meant to be a simple Halloween prank turned into something far more real and disturbing. The memories still haunt me, especially the pale faces and vacant eyes that accompanied me that night. To this day, I can't explain what really happened inside that mansion, but one thing is certain: it wasn't just any Halloween party. It was Halloween night, and the neighborhood was filled with costumed children and orange lights glowing on porches. I was accompanying a group of friends for the traditional trick-or-treating, but the street was more crowded than we expected, with groups everywhere. At one point, amid the confusion of people, I realized I had drifted away from my friends. The feeling of loneliness was almost immediate, despite the many people around. I decided to keep walking, hoping to find my group further ahead, but the street started to feel strangely deserted. The houses no longer had the festive lights or decorations I had seen earlier. They were old buildings with worn facades and dark windows, as if they had been abandoned for years. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind. I looked around, trying to recognize any familiar landmarks, but everything seemed different, as if the street had completely changed in a matter of minutes. That's when I saw her for the first time. A small girl, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight. She was wearing a tattered black dress and a witch's hat, holding a small pumpkin bucket in one hand. Her face was lowered, making it impossible to see her features. A wave of compassion and concern washed over me, as I wondered if she had also lost her friends or perhaps someone from her family. I approached her slowly, trying not to startle her. When I was just a few feet away, the girl lifted her head slowly. Her face was a sight that instantly froze my blood. Her skin was extremely pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were two dark hollows, as if there was nothing there. Her mouth twisted into a strange, distorted smile, revealing sharp, darkened teeth. I felt my body go rigid for a moment, as if I were under the influence of some malevolent trance. Without warning, the girl began to move toward me. Not running, but advancing in a nearly floating manner, her feet barely touching the ground. I tried to step back, but it felt as if my legs were stuck to the pavement. A deep sense of despair overtook me as she came closer and closer. It was as if time had slowed down and I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I finally managed to move, I started running down the street with no clear direction. I glanced back, hoping to see her further away, but the girl was still there, following me at a constant distance. No matter how fast I tried to run, she seemed to keep the same pace effortlessly. There was something unsettling about the way she followed me, as if she were toying with my fear, savoring every second of my agony. As I ran, I turned into a side street, hoping to lose her. The place felt even more desolate, with tall trees blocking the faint starlight. The wind blew harder, and I could feel her presence growing stronger. Every time I looked back, she seemed to be getting closer, the sinister smile never leaving her face. Finally, I reached a dead end and found myself trapped. With no other option, I turned to face the girl. She was just a few feet away now, and the smile on her face had turned into an expression of pure delight. The fear I felt was so intense that my vision began to blur. Then, in the blink of an eye, she vanished. There was no more sound, no movement. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I sensed I was being watched from all sides, even though there was no one else around. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken by the distant sounds of voices and laughter. I looked around and noticed that the street had returned to normal, with children and families passing by as if nothing had happened. My friends found me within minutes, asking where I had been and why I looked so pale. They laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them with a made-up story. Yet, something deeply disturbed me. When I looked down, I saw a small pumpkin bucket lying on its side, the same one the girl had been holding. The terror returned in full force, and I decided to leave that place as quickly as possible. Ever since that night, the image of the girl still appears in my dreams, a reminder that something truly evil happened that Halloween night. Perhaps she is still there, waiting for someone else to get lost, ready to start her macabre game all over again. It was an unofficial tradition among the teenagers in my town, spending Halloween night at the local cemetery. Many had tried before and left before midnight, but my friends and I decided that this year we would prove our bravery. The plan was simple. Pass through the rusty gates after the last church bell rang, find the oldest grave and stay there until dawn. We arrived at the cemetery around 11 o'clock. Low-hanging mist covered the tombstones, and the air was colder than I had expected for an October night. The shadows of the trees danced in the wind, creating a macabre and desolate scene. One of my friends made a point of mentioning local legends about ghosts and spirits that supposedly roamed the area. I didn't believe it, or at least tried to convince myself that I didn't, as we trudged through the uneven terrain. Our meeting point was the oldest grave in the cemetery, a gray stone headstone covered in moss and almost illegible, dating back to the mid-19th century. We settled around it, lighting the area with lanterns and candles. At first, everything seemed calm, with the distant sounds of laughter from other Halloween parties far off in the distance. However, as the night wore on, the temperature dropped abruptly, and an oppressive silence took over, muffling even the sound of the wind. Then we heard the first strange sound, a low, dragging whisper that seemed to come from all sides at once. I looked around, trying to identify the source, but all I saw were the shadows of tombstones and darkness between the trees. One of my friends laughed nervously, trying to break the tension, but the sound of his laughter felt out of place, almost unnatural in that setting. The whisper grew louder, as if several voices were trying to communicate at once, forming an incomprehensible chorus. That's when I noticed a figure in the distance, partially obscured by a broken tombstone. It was tall and slender, with indistinct contours, but clear enough to tell that it was watching us. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. My friends noticed it too, but no one dared to move or speak. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, before disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the cold became biting. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my shoulder, like an icy hand. I instinctively turned, but there was no one there. The whispers morphed into louder, more desperate murmurs, and the ground beneath us began to vibrate lightly, as if something were trying to emerge from below. Panic spread through the group, but everyone was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. That's when the ground around the oldest grave began to sink. The soil seemed to slowly open, revealing a deep, black hole. Something started to emerge, first as a pale, cadaverous hand, followed by a disfigured face with hollow eyes that stared at us with a look of hunger and desperation. The sight was so terrifying that my friends began to scream and run in different directions, disappearing into the darkness. I tried to run, but I tripped over an exposed root and fell near the freshly opened hole. The smell of damp earth and something rotten filled the air, so strong that it almost made me vomit. The pale hand tried to grab me, but I managed to break free and scramble away, my breathing fast and my heart racing. I glanced back only to see the figure retreating back into the hole, but its hollow eyes remained fixed on me even as it faded into the darkness. I finally reached the cemetery gates. My friends were waiting there, pale and breathless. None of us spoke about what had happened, but it was clear that we had all seen the same thing. The legends were true, and that cemetery housed something far more sinister than we had imagined. Since that night, the idea of a cemetery no longer fills me with curiosity, but with a deep sense of fear. I feel as if something stayed with me, a sense of being watched even when I'm alone. The oldest grave is still there, and the legend has only grown more popular among local teenagers. But I know, deep down, that those who dare to enter don't return with just stories to tell. They carry a mark with them, something that never truly leaves. On that Halloween night, the woods seemed darker than ever, with the tall, skeletal trees casting dense shadows under the full moon. My friends and I were there for a specific reason: to perform a ritual we had found in an old esoteric book, as a sort of prank to prove our bravery. The book, with yellowed pages and handwritten notes, claimed that the ritual could summon ancient entities, and this kind of threat only fueled our curiosity. We chose a deep clearing in the woods, surrounded by twisted trees and almost devoid of light. The path to the clearing was long, and the trail seemed to shift with every step, as if the woods themselves were trying to disorient us. Finally, we reached the clearing, where we placed black candles in a circle around a large, flat stone that would serve as our makeshift altar. The wind was almost non-existent, creating a stifling atmosphere. As we lit the candles and began to recite the words written in the book, something in the air changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a chilling breeze swept past us, causing the candle flames to flicker. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of dry leaves being crushed, as if someone was watching us from within the shadows. The sensation of being watched became oppressive, almost suffocating. Shortly after finishing the final phrase of the ritual, I began to sense a presence behind me. It felt as if something was there, standing still, almost touching my back. When I turned around, I saw a hooded figure a few meters away. The hood completely obscured its face, but the figure exuded a sense of pure malevolence, as if the surrounding darkness had materialized into a being. My friends, who had been laughing initially, were now silent, watching the figure with a mix of fear and fascination. More hooded figures started to emerge from the shadows, forming a circle around us, mirroring the shape of the candles. Their presence was overwhelming, as if we were trapped in a prison of living darkness. The figures remained still for a few moments before starting to move in sync, as if performing their own ritual. The murmuring of unintelligible words filled the air, and I felt a growing pressure in my head, as if the darkness itself were trying to invade my mind. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped inside the circle of candles and approached me. The feeling of terror was so intense that my body became paralyzed, unable to move or react. The figure began chanting words in a strange language, with a low, guttural voice, while making gestures over me. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something were being torn from within. The darkness seemed to pulse, almost as if it had a life of its own. At the height of the panic, a bright light appeared from behind the trees, breaking through the darkness and driving the hooded figures away. The light was so intense that I had to close my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, the figures had vanished, and silence once again reigned in the clearing. My friends looked confused and frightened, unable to comprehend what had just happened. We hurriedly gathered our things and tried to leave the woods, but the way back felt more twisted and unfamiliar than when we arrived. The feeling of being followed persisted throughout the walk back. I could hear light footsteps behind us, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but darkness. Finally, we reached the edge of the woods, and the town seemed farther away than before. My friends tried to talk about what we had seen, but none of us could find the words to describe the experience. In the following days, I started to feel a strange presence around me, even in broad daylight. Sometimes, I noticed quick shadows in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was never anything there. The sensation of being watched became constant, and one night I woke up feeling cold hands around my neck. Since then, I've had recurring nightmares, always featuring hooded figures surrounding me in a desolate and dark place. I never returned to the woods, nor did I have the courage to open that old book again. The ritual was just a Halloween prank, but it brought forth something we couldn't comprehend, something that continues to haunt me to this day. I don't know exactly what we summoned that night, but I know it wasn't just a scary story to tell friends. It was something real, something that left a mark that may never fade. On that Halloween night, the streets were filled with children running from door to door, their laughter mingling with the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. I decided to go trick-or-treating alone for a specific reason. I wanted to explore a particular house, known to be one of the oldest and eeriest in the neighborhood. There were always rumors that the woman who lived there was a strange recluse, only appearing on Halloween night. When I reached the rusty gate of the house, a shiver ran down my spine. The facade was gloomy, with dusty windows and faded curtains swaying slightly in the wind. The sense of abandonment was evident, yet it also felt like something was lurking behind the curtains. Despite this, my curiosity outweighed my fear, so I approached slowly and knocked on the old, creaky wooden door. To my surprise, the door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting for me. An elderly woman, with pale skin and hollow eyes, stood in the doorway. She wore a simple black dress that looked more like morning attire, and she held a small bowl of sweets. Her expression was neutral, almost apathetic, but there was something about her eyes that deeply unsettled me, a kind of empty void. She extended the bowl toward me, and the candies inside had a strange glow, as if they were made of polished glass. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity won, and I took one. It was cold and heavy in my hand, and a sickly sweet scent emanated from it. The woman closed the door without saying a word, and I descended the steps of the porch, still trying to understand what was so strange about that candy. When I reached the gate again, I looked back and noticed that all the lights in the house had gone out completely. There was no longer any sign of life there, as if I had been the only visitor in years. I decided to move on to the next house, but the street now seemed different. All the surrounding lights were off, and the silence was almost total. The only sound breaking the silence was that of my own footsteps. I kept walking, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the street seemed to stretch in a surreal way, as if I could never reach an end. The houses around me became less familiar, and the darkness grew thicker with each step. That's when I noticed something strange. The candy I had taken from the woman was melting in my hand, but not like a normal candy. The substance was thick, almost oily, and had a dark color that resembled coagulated blood. Fear began to take over, and I tried to retrace my steps. However, the eerie house seemed to have vanished, replaced by a dense, dark forest that shouldn't have been there. The air grew heavy, as if the environment itself were pressing down on me. I kept walking, now moving faster, trying to find a way out of that nightmare. Suddenly, I heard the sound of light footsteps behind me, as if someone were following me. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing but dark trees and shadows that seemed to shift on their own. The feeling of being followed became unbearable, and I started running, my heart pounding and cold sweat dripping down my face. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a claustrophobic tunnel of darkness. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance. I quickened my pace, hoping it was an exit, but as I got closer, I realized it was the same house I had left earlier. It was back in its place, as if nothing had happened. The door was open again, and the same old woman stood in the doorway, now with a sinister smile on her face. I felt my body freeze, as if an invisible force were preventing me from moving. The woman started to laugh softly, a hoarse and dry laugh that seemed to come from a place much deeper than her throat. Suddenly, I was pulled inside the house by an invisible force, and the door slammed shut behind me. The air turned cold, and everything around me seemed distorted, as if I were trapped in a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the empty gaze of the woman, who now seemed to have completely black eyes, devoid of any humanity. When I woke up, I was back on the street, alone, with the candy still in my hand, but now completely melted, leaving a dark stain on my palm. Since that night, something has changed. The feeling of being watched has never completely disappeared, and the sickly sweet scent of the candy seems to follow me wherever I go. I have never passed near that house again, and on Halloween nights, I avoid the area entirely. I don't know what really happened that night, but one thing is certain. It wasn't just an ordinary piece of candy, and that woman wasn't just an eccentric recluse. The street party on Halloween night was an annual event in my town, and everyone participated. The streets were packed with people in costumes, with loud music playing from all directions and flashing lights in shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of night that promised to be fun, but there was an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify. Something about this year's party felt different from previous ones, as if the darkness of the night was thicker, almost palpable. I was walking through the crowd, observing the extravagant costumes and trying to find my friends, when I noticed a masked man standing out among the people. He wore a simple, expressionless white mask and a black suit that seemed outdated. The most disturbing detail was that he was standing still, motionless, in a spot where everyone else around him was dancing or moving in some way. His eyes, hidden in the shadows of the mask, seemed to be fixed on me. At first, I thought it was just part of a prank, as Halloween parties often included actors trying to scare people. However, the way he kept watching me as I moved through the crowd started to make me uneasy. No matter where I went, he always seemed to be within sight, maintaining the same rigid and unmoving posture. Every time I glanced in his direction, he appeared closer, even though I never actually saw him walking toward me. I tried to ignore his presence and continued wandering through the party, participating in a few games and interacting with people around me. Yet, the feeling of being watched by that masked man persisted, growing stronger by the minute. I started to feel a slight discomfort, a pressure in my chest, as if something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. At one point, I decided to stop at a booth to grab a drink. That's when I noticed, in the reflection of a nearby shop window, that the masked man was now directly behind me, only a few meters away. He was completely still, but somehow, I knew he was aware of my every move. A shiver ran down my spine, and the air around me seemed to suddenly turn colder, as if the temperature had dropped drastically. When I turned to face him directly, he was closer than I had expected, and his masked face looked even more sinister up close. There were no distinctive features on the mask, just that empty, expressionless gaze that left me with a deep sense of discomfort. I decided it was time to leave, so I quickly moved away, trying to lose sight of the man in the crowd. I ran through side streets, ducking into alleys and cutting through paths, hoping to shake off the stranger. However, every time I stopped to catch my breath and looked back, He was there, always at the same distance, as if he didn't need to exert any effort to keep up with me. Fear began to turn into panic, and I felt my entire body trembling as I continued to flee. It was as if I were trapped in a macabre game, without knowing the rules or the objective. At one point, I turned into a darker alley, thinking I might finally escape, but the place was completely empty. The silence was absolute, with no sounds of the party in the distance. Suddenly, I felt an icy hand touch my shoulder, and the sensation was so intense that I nearly fainted. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there. The street was empty, except for the masked man, who was now standing at the other end of the alley, as motionless as ever. The terror I felt in that moment was indescribable. It was as if time had slowed down, each second dragging on in an endless agony. The man began to approach slowly, still without making any sound. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if something were pulling me down. The darkness around me started to close in, making it impossible to distinguish what was real and what was an illusion. Suddenly, the man stopped moving. He was now just a few feet away from me, and something about his presence changed. I felt an intense pressure in my mind, almost as if he were trying to communicate in a way I couldn't understand. Then, a horrifying thought struck me. This was not just a masked man. It was something much older, an entity that fed on fear and had chosen this night to hunt its victims. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of a low, distorted laugh that seemed to echo inside my head, coming from all directions at once. When I regained consciousness, I was back on the main street, surrounded by people who didn't seem to have noticed my absence. The party continued as if nothing had happened, but I knew something very real and very dangerous had just occurred. Since that night, whenever I see someone wearing a mask, even in an innocent context, I feel the same shiver run down my spine. The man at the street party was not just a Halloween figure. He was a dark presence that continues to haunt me, even in my dreams. I don't know what he really wanted or why he chose me that night, but I know I will never be the same. It was Halloween night, and the chill of autumn was beginning to blow stronger. My friends and I were looking for something scarier than the parties and parades happening in town. We decided to go to the old farm on the outskirts, a place known for its sinister legends. They said that many years ago, a cursed farmer had died there under mysterious circumstances, and since then, the place had been avoided by everyone. When we arrived at the entrance to the farm, the sight was even more frightening than I had imagined. The pumpkin field was in ruins, with dry vines and deformed plants stretching across the ground like skeletal claws. In the distance, at the center of the field, there stood a scarecrow, its tall, thin figure standing out in the darkness. It wore ragged clothes and an old straw hat, its face made of dirty cloth and black button eyes that seemed to be watching us from afar. My friends laughed nervously, saying it was just a silly dummy, but something about the way the scarecrow was positioned made me uneasy. Its arms were open, as if it were ready to embrace or capture us. There was something very wrong about the way it stood out in the empty field, motionless and sinister. We decided to approach it, laughing to ease the tension, but the closer we got, the more I felt a shiver run down my spine. When we were only a few meters away from the scarecrow, one of my friends suggested taking a picture next to it. Everyone agreed, but I stayed behind, unable to get any closer. There was a strange smell in the air, something rotten and metallic, seemingly emanating from the scarecrow. As the others took photos and posed around it, I noticed a subtle movement in its arms, as if one of its shoulders had slightly shifted toward me. I tried to ignore the growing fear, convincing myself it was just an optical illusion. But then, something unexpected happened. A sudden breeze swept across the field, blowing the scarecrow's hat away. At that moment, I noticed that its cloth head tilted to one side, as if it were looking directly at me. Panic seized me, and I shouted to my friends, urging them to leave. They began to laugh, thinking it was just another joke, but they soon realized I was serious. As we hurriedly moved away, the sound of dry footsteps emerged behind us, as if something were moving across the field. I looked back, and to my horror, the scarecrow was no longer where we had left it. It was now a few meters ahead, its figure bent unnaturally, as if it had fallen and awkwardly gotten up again. Its button eyes appeared more alive, reflecting the faint moonlight. We ran as fast as we could, but it seemed as if the scarecrow was chasing us, moving in a strange and erratic way. Every time I looked back, it was closer, as if it were crawling across the field with a malevolent purpose. My friends also began to panic, and our laughter turned into screams of terror. It was as if the field itself was trying to trap us, with vines tangling around our feet and roots emerging from the ground to slow us down. We reached the old barn, the only place that seemed to offer some form of shelter. We quickly shut the door and leaned against the wooden walls, trying to catch our breath. The silence inside the barn was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. After a few minutes, we thought the scarecrow might have given up. But then, we heard a low, dragging sound, as if something were scraping against the door. The fear became palpable as the sound intensified, followed by slow, rhythmic knocks on the wooden door. We could feel its presence outside, insistent and sinister. Suddenly, the barn door began to open slowly, revealing the scarecrow standing there, completely still, but somehow more menacing than before. Its button eyes were now glowing red, illuminated by a malevolent light. One of my friends tried to escape through a back window, but before he could do so, the scarecrow moved with terrifying speed, almost as if it were floating toward us. Despair overtook us, and the only thing I could do was run to the back of the barn, where there was a wooden ladder leading up to the loft. I climbed quickly, hoping the height would give us some advantage, but the scarecrow seemed to be getting closer, its footsteps now audible on the floor below us. In the loft, we found a small hatch on the ceiling that led to the barn's roof. I climbed through it, feeling the cold night air again, while my friends followed one by one. The scarecrow didn't stop, now climbing the ladder in a grotesque manner, like a giant spider. When we were finally all on the roof, we saw the scarecrow clinging to the edge, its arms stretched out toward us, as if it wanted to drag us back into the field. We jumped from the roof, landing on the hard, dry ground. We felt a sharp pain, but adrenaline drove us to keep running toward the main road. When we finally looked back, the scarecrow was back in the field, standing in its original spot, but now with the straw hat back on its head. It was as if nothing had happened, but the mark of fear remained with us. Since then, we never returned to that farm. The scarecrow remains there, a sinister figure that only seems to come to life on Halloween night. And I know deep down that it's just waiting for more curious visitors. It was late on Halloween night, and I was walking home alone after a lively party at a friend's house. The streets were deserted, with most people already indoors or making their last rounds of trick-or-treating. The temperature had dropped rapidly, and a thick fog was beginning to form at the street corners, obscuring the view of the old houses. Everything seemed quieter than usual, an eerie silence that muffled even the sound of my footsteps. That's when I heard something unusual, the distant sound of horse hooves striking the pavement. The rhythm was steady and slowly approaching, as if coming from a different era. At first, I thought it was just a Halloween prank, maybe a sound effect coming from a house further down the road. However, the sound felt too real, echoing through the empty street in a way I couldn't ignore. The creaking sound of wooden wheels soon joined the clip-clop of the hooves, and the air around me grew colder. When I looked back, I saw an old carriage slowly approaching. It was black as coal, with faded golden details, pulled by two skeletal horses exhaling dark mist from their nostrils. The coachman, a hooded and silent figure, held the reins with bony, cadaverous hands that barely stood out against the dark cloak covering his body. The carriage seemed like a specter from a forgotten time, materialized directly from a nightmare. Fear gripped me, but at the same time, a strange curiosity kept me from running. I stood still, watching the carriage get closer. It seemed almost unreal, like a vision from another world, yet its presence was overwhelming. When the carriage finally stopped beside me, I felt an intense wave of cold sweep through my body, as if death were only a few steps away. The coachman slowly raised his head, revealing a face concealed in the darkness of the hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt his gaze, fixed and penetrating, as if he were trying to read my soul. I felt a deep terror, a sense that something very old and malevolent was there, waiting for me. The carriage door opened slowly, emitting a low, unsettling creak. The interior was completely dark, a void that seemed to both invite and threaten at the same time. I felt a strange force pulling me toward the carriage, as if I were being sucked inside. I tried to move backward, but my legs were paralyzed, frozen by uncontrollable fear. The coachman made a slow gesture with his hand, as if inviting me to enter. The dread intensified, and it was only then that I managed to step back a few paces, nearly tripping on the sidewalk. The carriage remained still for a few seconds, as if waiting for me to change my mind. The coachman lowered his head, appearing disappointed, and the carriage doors slammed shut. Without further delay, the skeletal horses began to trot again, and the carriage slowly continued on its way, disappearing into the fog. The chill lingered, and I felt as though something significant had been decided that night, something I couldn't fully understand. I kept walking toward my house, trying to process what had just happened. The silence was even more unsettling now, as if the sound of the carriage still echoed in my mind. When I was about to reach my street, I heard the sound of hooves again, this time much closer. I quickly turned around and saw the carriage once more, emerging from the fog like a ghost, moving faster in my direction. This time, the sense of danger was much more intense. I felt that if the carriage caught up with me, I would be dragged to an unknown and terrible fate. I ran as fast as I could, the sound of the hooves now deafening behind me. The horse's breathing was audible, a harsh, otherworldly sound that seemed to come straight from hell. My whole body was consumed by absolute panic, and each corner seemed to distort, making my escape even more desperate. I finally reached my house and slammed the door behind me, feeling a wave of relief and exhaustion. I looked out the window, expecting to see the carriage outside, but the street was empty, enveloped only by the fog and the silence of the early morning. However, the fear did not completely fade. I could still feel the presence of the coachman, as if he were waiting outside, hidden in the shadows. In the days that followed, the memory of that night continued to haunt me. I began to avoid walking alone at night, especially on deserted streets. I could still hear the sound of hooves from time to time, like a distant echo in my mind. Local legends speak of a phantom carriage that seeks lost souls on Halloween night, and now I knew it wasn't just a story to scare children. I had encountered the coachman, and I felt that he would return to complete his journey someday. Since then, I have developed an inexplicable fear of Halloween nights, especially when I hear the distant sound of hooves. I don't know what really happened that night, but I know that the carriage was not just a passing vision. It was a hungry entity, an ancient presence that will continue to roam the dark streets in search of more victims. The Halloween night was cold and foggy, and the air felt denser as I walked through the dark streets of the city. My destination was the old abandoned asylum at the end of the main street, an imposing building with peeling walls and broken windows, which had always been the subject of ghost stories. That night, something drew me there in an almost irresistible way. A mysterious invitation had appeared in my mailbox that morning, announcing a ghostly ball at the asylum. The invitation was dated 1923, with golden lettering and an old seal that seemed to belong to another era. Upon arrival, I noticed that the place was unusually illuminated, with candles scattered in the windows and soft, distant music filling the air. The rusty, creaky gate was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. I took a deep breath and crossed the yard covered in dry leaves, feeling a chill that seemed to come from the very stones beneath my feet. The asylum felt much more alive than on any other night, as if it were waiting for me. When I entered the main hall, I was met with an unexpected sight. The place was fully decorated for a 1920s-style ball. Crystal chandeliers sparkled on the ceiling, and elegantly dressed people danced to the sound of a jazz band playing in the background. All the guests seemed to be in costume, wearing period clothing, masks, and antique accessories. There was a strange aura about them, as if everything were a black and white illusion, a spectacle out of time. I felt a mix of fascination and fear as I walked through the hall. The dancers moved slowly and rhythmically, almost mechanically, with pale faces and frozen smiles. I looked around, trying to understand the situation, but everything seemed too real to be a mere staging. A waiter passed by, offering a glass of champagne on a silver tray, and I noticed that his face was covered by a porcelain mask, with completely empty eyes. I continued wandering through the hall, observing the disturbingly precise details of the party. The walls were lined with portraits of old faces, and a large mirror reflected the image of the guests in a distorted manner. As the night wore on, I began to feel an oppressive presence, as if I were being watched from all sides. The music started to sound slower, almost dragged out, and the dancers' steps became heavier and more disjointed. Then, I noticed something truly disturbing. The guests' features were changing. Their faces, once vaguely human, began to deform grotesquely, with sunken eyes, pale skin, and mouths that twisted into macabre smiles. The atmosphere grew denser, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. The candles, which had previously lit the hall with a warm glow, now cast darker and more menacing shadows. I decided it was time to leave, but as I headed toward the entrance door, I found it was locked. I tried to force it open, but it felt as if something was holding it firmly from the other side. Panic began to set in, and I realized the guests had stopped dancing, now all facing me as if they were waiting for something. Their empty eyes were fixed on me, and their mouths slowly opened in a chorus of unintelligible whispers. In the middle of the hall, a female figure appeared, wearing an old, faded wedding dress. Her skin was translucent, and her eyes, black and deep, reflected a disturbing emptiness. She started walking toward me, with slow, heavy steps, as if she were moving underwater. I felt a wave of absolute terror, as if something very old and malevolent were trying to envelop me. The figure extended her hand toward me, and I felt an icy chill sweep through my body, as if all the life were being drained from me. Desperate, I ran to the second floor of the asylum, trying to find another way out. The corridors were filled with skeletal figures, some sitting in old wheelchairs, others standing still, merely watching me pass. The music continued, now distorted and slower, almost like a lament. Finally, I found a broken window at the end of a corridor and decided to take the risk, jumping out. I landed in the asylum's yard, feeling a sharp pain in my ankle upon hitting the ground. I looked back and saw the figures of the guests in the windows, silently watching my escape. The female figure was still there, standing in the main hall, with an empty smile that seemed to follow me as I ran. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the wind in the dry leaves and the distant echo of the music that still played. When I reached the main street, the asylum seemed to have returned to its normal state, abandoned and dark, with no sign of light or music. However, the invitation in my hand was still there, now with faded letters and a date that appeared to have changed to the current year. Since that night, the asylum has never seemed the same to me, and the stories about the ghostly ball have taken on new meaning. Something tells me that the party continues, waiting for more curious visitors who wish to dance until dawn. The Halloween night was bustling at the city park, with colorful lights and game booths everywhere. The atmosphere was fun, but there was a certain mysticism in the air that was impossible to ignore. Among the various attractions, one in particular caught my attention. A newly installed hall of mirrors, its facade covered with distorted images and promises of unique scares for the bravest visitors. Something about its appearance felt both inviting and threatening, and I couldn't resist the curiosity. From the outside, the hall of mirrors seemed small, but I quickly realized it was more complex than it appeared. As I entered, I was enveloped in darkness, broken only by small red lights on the floor that marked the path. The walls were made of tall, narrow mirrors, reflecting my image from every possible angle. At first, it was easy to distinguish the correct paths, but as I advanced, everything became more confusing and distorted. The mirrors reflected my image in strange ways, almost deformed, as if they were trying to reveal something deeper than my face. As I ventured further into the maze, the feeling of being watched became more intense. It wasn't just my own reflection that followed me. There was something else, something hiding in the shadows of the reflections. Looking at the mirrors began to make me uncomfortable as I noticed small changes in my reflection. A subtle smile that didn't match what I was feeling, or eyes that blinked at different times than mine. It was as if the mirrors were becoming entities of their own, each with a distorted will. After a few minutes of walking, I started to lose track of time and space. The corridors seemed endless, and the distant sound of laughter echoed in a way that confused me even more. I tried to follow the sound, hoping it would lead me to the exit, but each attempt only seemed to take me deeper into the maze. The red lights on the floor began to flicker erratically, and the darkness between the mirrors seemed to deepen, almost like an abyss. Then, I started to see strange figures in the reflections. They weren't just distorted versions of myself, but other people with old features and clothing from past eras. Their faces were pale, with hollow, lifeless eyes, as if they had been trapped there for a long time. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they weren't just appearing in the mirrors, but seemed to follow me almost intentionally. A sense of dread began to take over, and the only thing I could do was try to move faster, hoping to find the exit. At one point in the maze, I found myself in a wider room of mirrors, where the walls were completely covered with infinite reflections of myself. I felt a strange weight on my shoulders, as if the air around me was becoming heavier and denser. I looked into one of the mirrors and noticed that my reflection was different. The eyes were darker, with an expression of terror that didn't match what I was feeling at that moment. I began to realize that the reflections were trying to manipulate me, showing versions of myself that were disturbingly real but slightly different. Then, one of the reflections began to move independently. I felt a sharp chill as it slowly approached the glass, as if it were trying to step out of the mirror. I tried to back away, but the reflection seemed to gain strength, banging on the glass surface with pale, contorted hands. The sound of cracking glass echoed through the room, intensifying my panic. With each bang, the glass seemed to crack more, and the reflection displayed a macabre smile, as if it were about to break through and reach me. In desperation, I tried to find another path, but now all the mirrors showed different versions of me, each one more frightening than the last. One had empty, lifeless eyes, while another appeared to be covered in dried blood. I felt an overwhelming presence around me, as if the maze itself were alive, trying to trap me there forever. The sound of shattering glass grew louder, and I realized that the nearest reflection was almost breaking out of the mirror, with a cadaverous hand pushing through the cracked surface. I decided to run as fast as I could, ignoring the paths and just trying to get away from the horror. The darkness seemed to close in on all sides, and the mirrors now reflected only shadows, as if I were being followed by faceless figures. Finally, after what felt like hours of fleeing, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It was the entrance to the maze, now appearing as my only hope of escape. I sprinted toward the light, feeling a wave of relief as I crossed the exit. When I finally found myself outside the maze, I looked back and saw the figures in the mirrors still watching me, motionless but with an expression of disappointment, as if I had narrowly escaped. The air outside was lighter, but the feeling of dread remained, like a mark I knew wouldn't disappear anytime soon. Since that night, I've avoided mirrors, especially in dark places. The memory of the maze still haunts me, and sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see reflections that shouldn't be there. The Hall of Mirrors seemed like a harmless attraction, but it turned out to be a portal to something much darker and older, something I still feel is lurking, waiting to capture me again.